Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something, kind of terrifying when you really think about it.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
It's this idea called eternal recurrence.
From Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right, Nietzsche.
Yeah.
So it's like this, okay, imagine you, the listener, you wake up and you just know that every single thing you've ever done, felt, experienced, every little detail, it's all going to happen again.
Exactly the same.
Exactly the same again and again and again forever. A never-ending loop, no escape, no changes. That's eternal recurrence.
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it? Like, if you knew for sure your life was just going to be this infinite replay, how would that change how you live right now?
Yeah, would you even want to change anything? Would it just be pure despair or, I don't know, maybe something else?
That's what we're going to explore today. What we found really interesting in the research for this deep dive is, you'd think eternal recurrence is just this philosophical idea, right? But there are all these hints from science and psychology that make it feel, a lot less theoretical.
Okay, so let's start with choice. We like to think we're in control, making decisions, but what if that's not really how it works?
Yeah, there's this fascinating line of research in neuroscience that suggests our conscious decisions, the ones we think we're making, might not be the starting point at all.
So, we're not actually in control.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Back in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet, a neuroscientist, did these experiments.
Okay.
And he found that before someone consciously decides to do something, like move their hand, there's this burst of activity in the brain. They called it the readiness potential.
So the brain's getting ready even before you think about it.
Exactly. The implication is that our brains might be initiating actions before we're even aware of making a choice.
Wow.
Yeah. It's almost like our brains are making the decision and our conscious mind is just catching up, coming up with a story for why we chose to do it.
So I decided to pick up my coffee cup, but my brain already started the process before I even thought coffee.
It could be like that, yeah. And if our choices aren't truly free in the moment, if they're kind of predetermined by this prior brain activity, it makes you think about the whole idea of a preset path.
Right. If that's happening moment to moment, it's not that big of a leap to think maybe our whole life is a script we're just playing out.
And if that's the case, repeating that script forever.
Yeah, that's intense. But hold on, if this has happened countless times, like in eternal recurrence, why don't we remember any of it?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of how memory actually works. You see, memory isn't like a perfect recording. It's more like it's a reconstructive process. Every time you remember something, you're basically rebuilding it in your mind.
Really?
Yeah. And that process is, it's pretty susceptible to change. It can be influenced by your current mood, new information, even by what other people tell you.
I've heard of that. Didn't someone do experiments where they implanted false memories?
Yes. Elizabeth Loftus, she's done a lot of work in that area. It's pretty amazing and a little scary how malleable memory can be.
So maybe that's why we don't remember past cycles, even if they happened. Our memory just keeps getting rewritten.
Exactly. The unreliability of memory could be the reason we don't have access to those experiences, even if eternal recurrence is happening.
It makes you wonder about, déjà vu. You know that feeling when you're like, wait, I've done this before. Maybe it's not just a glitch in the brain.
Right. What if it's like a little echo from a past iteration, but our minds just can't fully grasp it?
And what about the Mandela effect? When lots of people have the same false memory, that's got to mean something, right?
The Mandela effect definitely shows how our memories can be influenced and how they can be wrong, even when we share them with theirs. Whether it means we're slipping between different realities or it's just a quirk of how our brains work, it definitely shows that memory isn't always reliable.
Which, thinking about eternal recurrence makes you wonder what we're really remembering, if anything. Right. Okay, so our choices might not be as free as we think, and our memories are, kind of shaky.
Mm-hmm.
So what else is going on here? What are these hidden forces pushing us around?
Well, there are the forces inside us, like our subconscious programming, stuff we're not even aware of. And then there are forces outside of us, like all the societal norms, marketing messages, just the whole structure of how the world works.
Yeah, it's like we're swimming in this current we don't even see.
Exactly. We're constantly being influenced by things we're not even aware of.
And then there's this idea Freud talked about, repetition compulsion. It's like we're drawn to repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah, it's this unconscious urge to replay painful experience. And it's not about trying to fix them or learn from them. It's more like, we're just drawn to what's familiar, even if it hurts.
And if we're doing that in one life, what's stopping us from doing it again and again in an eternal loop?
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, you, the listener, do you see any patterns like that in your own life? Those things you keep doing, even though they don't really serve.
It's a lot to think about. Okay, so we've got all these external pressures and internal programming pushing us around. But then there's the whole question of the self, right?
Yeah.
Like, who are we, really?
That's where things get really interesting. Neuroscience and psychology are starting to suggest that this self we experience, this continuous sense of I, it might not be as solid and unchanging as we think.
So it's not like there's this little me inside my head driving the bus.
Not exactly. The idea is that the self is more like a story our brain is constantly creating. The brain's taking all these experiences, these feelings, these thoughts, and weaving them into a narrative that we then identify as ourselves.
So the brain's like a storyteller.
Yeah, it's a storyteller, a meaning maker. It's constantly trying to create a cohesive me out of all these fragmented experiences. And there's actually some pretty interesting research with split brain patients that suggests we might even have multiple consciousnesses within one brain.
Whoa, wait, multiple.
Yeah, split brain patients are people who've had the connection between the two hemispheres of their brain severed. And sometimes it seems like the two sides are acting independently, almost like two different selves. Pretty wild.
Fuck, that's blowing my mind a little. Okay, so there's that, and then there's this thing called the default mode network, right?
Yeah, the DMN. This is a network of brain regions that's active when we're not focused on anything specific in the outside world, like when we're daydreaming or thinking about the past or worrying about the future.
So basically, when we're in our heads.
Exactly. And the thing is, when the DMN is active, it's reinforcing our sense of self. It's like we're replaying our personal story over and over.
Okay, but if the self is really just a story, and the brain is always updating that story, what does that mean for eternal recurrent? Like, what's actually being repeated? Just a pattern of brain activity.
Right. It gets to the core of what we even mean by if the self isn't a fixed thing, if it's constantly changing, then what does it even mean for the same you to relive the same life? It's a really tricky question.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, we've questioned our choices, our memories, even who we are. But what about the mind itself? How does that play into this whole trap of eternal repetition?
Our research dives into this quite a bit. Think about it. The average person has something like 60,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot of thinking.
Yeah, but I bet a lot of those are just like random stuff, right?
Well, that's the thing. Studies suggest that about 95% of those thoughts are the same ones we had yesterday.
Really?
Yeah, so we're basically stuck in these mental loops, replaying the same worries, the same anxieties, the same desires.
It's a broken record.
It is. And if, as neuroscience suggests, our decisions are often already in motion before we're even aware of them, it makes you wonder how much control we really have to break free from those loops. These subconscious programs are so ingrained, they're shaped by everything we've experienced, all our conditioning, and they can really dictate our actions and reactions without us even realizing.
So it's like we're running on autopilot.
In a way, yes. And that can make real lasting change pretty tough. It's not just about making a conscious decision. We have to dig deeper and address those underlying patterns.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. Thinking about this idea of the observer, it's like, okay, we can step back and watch our thoughts and feelings, but then who's doing the watching?
Right. It's called metacognition, and it raises some really profound questions. If you can observe your thoughts coming and going, who is the you that's doing the observing? If you can notice your emotions changing, who's the one feeling them?
It's like there's this part of us that's separate from all the mental noise.
Exactly. And the unsettling part is some philosophers argue that this observing self, this awareness, might be the truest part of it. But it might also be completely passive, unable to actually change anything.
So like we're just stuck watching the movie of our lives play out again and again, and we can't hit pause or rewind.
That's one way to look at it. And then there's Jung's idea of the shadow self.
Shadow self.
Yeah, it's this hidden part of our psyche, all the stuff we don't like to acknowledge about ourselves, the fears, the negative impulses, the parts we think are unacceptable.
Okay.
And Jung's idea is that the shadow, it actually craves the familiar, even if it's painful. It resists change because change is scary, even if the familiar is hurting.
That's a bit disturbing. So we're not just trapped by external forces or even our own brain. Part of us actually wants to stay stuck.
It's possible. It means maybe we're more complicit in these cycles than we realize. And it brings up this big question, do we really want to escape, even if we could?
I mean, I think I do, but yeah, maybe there's a part of me that's scared of what's on the other side. So is there any way out of this, or like at least a different way to think about it all?
There are definitely different perspectives. Nietzsche himself, even though he came up with eternal recurrence, he also offered a way to deal with it. He called it amor fati.
Amor fati.
It means love of fate. It's this idea that you should live your life so fully, so authentic, that you would want to relive it, every bit of it, forever.
To love every single moment, even the bad one.
Exactly. It's about radical acceptance, about finding meaning and joy in the whole experience no matter what.
That's pretty intense. So that's the philosophical take. What about science? Are there any hints from science that maybe this isn't all just a thought experiment?
There are actually some interesting ideas in cosmology, the study of the universe. You know, the Big Bang.
Yeah, the beginning of everything.
Right. Well, the Big Bounce theory suggests that maybe the Big Bang isn't a one-time thing. Maybe the universe expands and then contracts, then expands again, and so on forever.
So like an infinite loop of universes.
Yeah, exactly. And if that's true, maybe each cycle is similar to the last one, maybe even a repetition.
So eternal recurrence, but on a cosmic scale.
Whoa. And then there's this even wilder idea from quantum physics. It's called quantum immortality and has to do with the multiverse.
Okay, I've heard of the multiverse. Like there are infinite universes where everything's slightly different.
Exactly. And the idea of quantum immortality is that, okay, imagine every time there's a possibility of you dying, your consciousness just jumps to a universe where you survive.
Like I almost get hit by a car, but in another universe, I did get hit.
Right, and your consciousness is now in the universe where you're still alive.
And that just keeps happening forever.
Potentially, yes. So even if it's not the exact same life repeating, it could be that variations of your life are playing out across this infinite multiverse.
So kind of like eternal recurrence, but with more variety. All right, that's a lot to take in. You know, going back to psychology, our sources talk about the mind being like a prison. Are there ways to break free from these mental patterns, these loops we keep getting stuck in?
Definitely. Psychology emphasizes that awareness is the first step. You know, noticing your thoughts, your behaviors, and starting to see those patterns, the things you keep repeating. Once you see them, you can start to understand what's driving them.
Like, what are those fears and insecurities that keep me stuck in the same rut, even if I know it's not good?
Exact. And there are lots of tools that therapy can be really helpful, so can mindfulness practice. And just learning to question your own thoughts, to challenge those automatic responses you have.
So it's about taking control, being more deliberate about how we think and act. And lastly, our sources mention Buddhism and this idea of samsara.
Right. Samsara is the cycle of suffering and rebirth that Buddhism talks about. It's driven by attachment, desire, and this idea of a permanent self.
So kind of similar to eternal recurrence, but Buddhism says there's a way out.
Exactly. In Buddhism, the way out is enlightenment, or nirvana. And that's about realizing that everything is impermanent, detaching from desires, and seeing through the illusion of the separate self.
So it's a very different way of thinking about the world and ourselves.
It is. And it suggests that maybe the key to escaping these cycles, whether they're literal or metaphorical, lies in changing our internal relationship to ourselves and to reality itself.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about our choices maybe not being as free as we think, about how our memories are unreliable, about hidden forces influencing us, about the self maybe being an illusion, about the mind being a trap, and, all of that in the context of this mind-blowing idea of eternal recurrence.
It really forces you to confront some big questions, doesn't it? What do you truly value? Are you living in a way that aligns with those values? How would you feel if you had to live this life exactly as it is, over and over?
That's the big question. So listener, I'm really curious. What are your thoughts on all of this? How does this concept of eternal recurrence land for you after our deep dive?
Could you, like Nietzsche suggests, embrace it? Could you live so fully that you wouldn't change a thing even if you had to live it all again forever?
It's a powerful idea to sit with. So here's one last thought to leave you with. Imagine waking up tomorrow and everything feels exactly the same. Your day unfolds just like it always does, but deep down, this isn't the first time. This day, this very moment has already happened countless times before. Would you do anything differently? Or are you already on a path you're destined to repeat? Think about that as you go about your day, as you experience this very moment right now.